Well, hello all. I hopefully this will work and eventually will send and load and all that good stuff. As I'm lecturing from our hotel room in Cancun. Darn, it's a tough life, but someone has to do it. Everything going well here, and I hope everything going well your way. And whenever you listen to this is Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day to all. If someone hasn't wished you to it yet, and here we go. This is 11B. So we did A, and then I'll look at the Welsh Hall PowerPoint sequence when we get done with this particular chapter. But this one covers it, and this is all about membrane potentials. And we did a lot of it, but the reality is, I get organized, is that it's different because we're dealing with things like an all or none phenomenon, a little bit different than muscle in the sense that once it fires completely. Uh, you have to redo the whole. Effectively, you have to refire it again. It's a different mechanism because we're not dealing with the sliding filament aspect of things and calcium voltage gated channels on the interior. We are dealing with them along the nerve, of course, and it has to do a lot with the different neurotransmitters and understand. Effectively, it's two types of signals: fire or don't fire. Fire is what we call a depolarizing thing, so we call them graded potentials, not end plate potentials. There's no end plate. And so it just says fire, that's going to be a depolarizing impetus, make it closer to threshold, whatever threshold, or hyperpolarizing it, taking it farther away, going more negative. Depolarizing, just less polarized, hyper, more polarized. Those are the only signals. Depending on the neurotransmitters or the different nerves that are coming in contact with that particular nerve, and it's the summation, if you want to use that term, it's all of those adding up, those fire or don't fires adding up until finally it fires or it doesn't. So it's very very rapid, much more so than the nervous system, than the muscular system, and that was fairly rapid. Endocrine, as you'll see when we get to that more slowly, and they're very excitable. And this is the electricity aspect, and thank goodness we're not going to do any of it. We know, and basically it's all about the voltage, the potential energy, because of the charge separation along the membrane, positive on the outside, negative on the inside. We did this with the cell, didn't change any. We did this with muscles, didn't change any, etc., etc., etc. Don't care. Bingo. Now the complex part has to do with these different channels, okay, and whether they're ligand gated or voltage gated. And so when we're talking about these ions, they're very, very specific. With these, unlike the neuromuscular junction where we have sodium influx and potassium efflux, okay, typically these are one ways. They have one ion or one particular electrolyte passes through. You're going to see we have sodium, we have potassium, and we also have chloride in that. Chloride's a big player here. And of course, we have leakage channels, which are always open. Nothing unusual. That's about resting membrane potential. That didn't change a whole lot. And we have gated channels, and based on the shape change, and they're either going to be chemically gated, voltage gated, or mechanically gated. We looked at the ear. That was a mechanically gated channel. Okay. Chemically gated, we've looked at numerous times already. Neuromuscular junction. Voltage gated, along basically the action potential carrying itself along the membrane, the voltage gated channel for calcium as the nerve impulse causes the release of the acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. Those are all classic examples. So you're going to see in this case, but since it's all nervous system, we're talking neurotransmitters, and fortunately, the one probably we have the most of in our bodies is acetylcholine. You've already got that covered. So this is why I like it to do it this way because you build fairly effectively and efficiently on this. So voltage gated, all about changes, that flip flopping of the membrane potential, like a wave going through water, basically anything that makes you think about that. And we're looking at waves now, and boom, boom, boom. Those constant changes that are there, and mechanically, physical deformation, moving it. Think of the eardrum vibrating, moving, if you will. So you can take here. We can take a look at them. So chemicals, whatever the chemical is, in this case, whether it opens the door for sodium or not, and voltage gated. And you can see here, it has to do with effectively changes in the voltage when normally positive outside, negative inside. Well, when that wave comes through and rapidly changes from negative to positive, it opens and then it resets. That are there. And it's very, very, you'll find when we talk about how the nervous system works, that certain neurotransmitters are faster than others. Ones that are voltage gated, not big part, ones that are movement of ions that are stated. Charged particle moves very rapid responses. It's a little different with other neurotransmitters, like those biogenic amines we're going to look at, like epinephrine and norepinephrine and dopamine, a little bit different. They work to some extent indirectly rather than movement of charged particles rapidly in and out. And it's all about the rapidity of it. So and it's the old story: things that happen fast go away fast. Things that happen slower, and by no means slow. We're going from tiny numbers of milliseconds to greater numbers of milliseconds when we're looking at the difference, but it's perceptibly slower. And so those are and a concentration gradient and blah, 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 blah. And we're not going to look at the gradient and all that, but back, sort of repeating ourselves. So typical resting potential -70. It depends on the particular cell. You can see there's rather significant range, nothing different, positive outside, negative inside, and polarity. It's all about the intra and extracellular fluid and the aspect of permeability. And this is sort of the review of what we saw previously. And previously, when that animation has to do with, we have more potassium sets it because there's more potassium leak channels, and then sodium leak channels, and then the sodium is reattracted back in because of the excessive potassium leaking out, and voila, we end up with a resting membrane potential. And of course, and that's the permeability is directly related to the number of leakage channels that are there. So important. Extracellular fluid, more sodium, and why it's only along the membrane where we see the charge difference. It's balanced off by chloride. Again, you're going to see the relevance of chloride because a new channel is opening called a chloride gated channel. And those are significant, very, very much so vis-a-vis medical, very significant in really causing significant amounts of hyperpolarization. It plays a pivotal role, particularly we'll talk about it in neurotransmitters. The intracellular, the big player is potassium. We knew that. What keeps the interior of the cytoplasm neutral is proteins. And so proteins are too large to exit. When proteins are dissolved within the cytoplasm, any of the acidic moieties lose their protons, exposes, C00 with a negative charge, voila. Okay, now you got it. And potassium is the big player. This is another one of these. I hope it plays here that you will be able to hear.
Called neurons. A neuron, like all cells, has negatively and positively charged ions in the fluids located both inside and outside of the cell. However, the ionic composition of these two fluids is markedly different. The inner surface of the membrane is negatively charged, while the outer surface is positively charged. This unequal distribution of charge creates a voltage across the plasma membrane, known as the membrane potential. In a resting, unstimulated neuron, this membrane potential is known specifically as the resting membrane potential. The value of the resting membrane potential depends on two factors. The first is the presence of concentration gradients across the plasma membrane, especially those gradients for sodium and potassium ions. The second is the permeability of the plasma membrane to sodium and potassium. In the resting state, this permeability depends on the number of non-gated leak channels present in the membrane for these ions. The magnitude of the resting membrane potential, inside relative to outside, is measured in millivolts using a voltmeter and two electrodes. We'll now place both electrodes in the extracellular fluid. Note that the voltmeter records 0 voltage. This is because the unequal distribution of charge exists only across the plasma membrane. The intra and extracellular fluids are otherwise electrically neutral. However, when we insert one of the electrodes into the intracellular fluid, a voltage is recorded. The value of the resting membrane potential varies, but on average it is minus 70 millivolts.
Yeah, and we've seen that before. So I mean, it's useful to listen to, and if that helps you. And again, nothing special here. Again, depends on the difference between potassium and sodium concentrations inside and out, permeability, etc. So we're familiar with this. I don't think this is, and these are certainly the pumps, and constantly busy because the nerves are constantly busy. So they play a tremendous role. And so you can see the impermeability to the large anionic proteins, slightly much more permeable, as you can see, to potassium. And notice the chloride. That's significant. I keep saying that. So voila, all that potassium out, sodium diffuses in, the constant resetting and the constant, if you will, busyness or increased activity of the sodium potassium pumps, continually to maintain those gradients is an important factor as well. And it's a little difficult. If I had it on the board, it might be easier to see. I think it's a little bit easier to see here and for us to talk, to go through that. So, I mean, if you want to go through those, that's fine. But this is the big deal for this. Membrane potential changes when concentration of ions across membranes change. Membrane permeability to ions change. Two types. And this is the difference. We still have action potentials. That didn't change. The difference, again, is graded potentials versus end plate potentials. And the whole idea, even though you're making a change along the membrane, its ability to move based on the degree of change is limited. So it doesn't reach that. It's just not a powerful enough change to reach, just like it is in the motor end plate, and along the endomysium and along the sarcolemma to reach those voltage gated for sodium and potassium channels. Same deal here. And so, and that's what it's all about. So the terms we described, relative, would be depolarizing, decreasing the potential, more positive, inside less negative, any way you want to view it, likely to increases the likelihood of an impulse occurring. Versus the opposite, we have hyperpolarizing influences, decreasing it, making more negative, hyperpolarizing, increasing the amount of polarity, or increasing the difference in overall, making it more negative, or the difference between positive and negative, as it were. And they're just showing it to you graphically here. So, I mean, and these are little steps. The question is, do we get whatever the number you want? Is it 50? Is it 55? Nobody cares because there's enough variation. It's the idea that neither of these in and of themselves are able to alter. Certainly, this will not reach an action potential, and this is a relatively small change, but it makes it a little bit harder. So, by definition, again, plate potential, short-lived, local changes, farther the current flows, and of course, we have to get to that level. So, until we get to that level where those gated ion channels are in close sequence, then it will self-perpetuate. So, named according to location, are there receptor potentials, generator potentials? Don't care. Yeah. So, receptor potentials is more associated with sensory. Postsynaptic potentials means after, effectively, what it has done to the nerve. So, the receptor has received a signal, making a change. Postsynaptic means after the synapse, what is the potential like? What's it telling the nerve to do? Fire or don't fire? Got it. So, not much here. Self-limiting, wherever you would apply the stimulus. And this is something that we do when we test nerves. I talked about a little bit with electromyography, and maybe we'll do that in the lab on the 17th, depending on when you're listening to this when I return. Basically, where we stimulate that nerve, it gives us an idea of how far, the farther you look, if you're stimulating a nerve going into your hand, if you move the sensor back farther, more distance, you'll see some subtle changes based on the distance. But here, this is more about the degree of the stimulus. You get a very, very localized change, and it degrades. So you can see it rapidly changes it from the original positive to negative to positive, but it doesn't have the oomph, so to speak, the amplitude of that signal to make long changes, so it dissipates quickly. So you can see what happens. The initial site depolarizes rather rapidly, but the degrading in a matter of just a couple of millimeters of the nerve. Action potentials, long distances. We talked about muscles already. Now we got axons of neurons. It's a brief but exceptionally powerful reversal to the tune of about 100 millivolts. So you're going from minus 70 arbitrarily to positive 30 at the area. Once that level is reached, once you hit to that threshold, boom, you target those voltage gated sodium and potassium channels, and they do not decay over distance. And we create what we call a nerve impulse. And it's very much of an all or none phenomenon. Either it's going to happen or not. And now you can look at the players. You can look at what they are, and you'll see it better animation wise, I'm sure. This gate's closed. You'll notice what they call the activation gate, this little ball like structure I commented on before, is open. The major gate entry is closed. Now, when it's opened by a depolarization wave, the main gate opens, but the inactivation gate is still open. What happens in the process of repolarization, as soon as sodium has rushed in there in the brief period of time that this was negative on the outside and positive on the inside, as soon as that flips, that inactivation gate, so even though this is still open, but because of an inactivation gate, it's not getting through. The channels are automatically blocked by the inactivation gate soon after they open. That's that period of time I have alluded to before, called an absolute refractory period. The door is still there. Even if the door is partially open, you can't get it. It's latched, locked, whatever you want to think of it. So it's a combination of the gate closing and, more importantly, as you can see here, the inactivation gate. You only see them on sodium voltage gated channels. You do not on potassium. And this is what happens afterwards. The next gate it comes to is potassium. Out goes the potassium, quick repolarization, and then what comes after that? The sodium potassium pumps going crazy because we just set an impulse. Again, this resets the cell electrically, so we have sodium coming in, increasing the interior to positive, potassium going out, bringing it repolarizing and bringing the interior back to negative. But now we flip flop sodiums and potassiums. We destroyed the internal balance and inside and the external balance of sodium outside, potassium inside. And that's when your sodium potassium pumps get busy. So to summarize it, they're all there. The leakage channels are maintaining the resting membrane potential along with the pumps. And each sodium channel has two voltage sensitive gates. The activation gate, the one is the big gate that allows the sodium in, closed at rest, opens with depolarization. The inactivation gate, open at rest, but blocks the channel once it is open to prevent more sodium, so it limits it. Potassium channel, one gate only, closed or open. And that's why we see the big change. Here at rest, nothing happening. Once it reaches threshold, you're going to see that sharp spike up and it's down. And notice, inevitably, there's a certain amount of overshoot. You see this as a continued pattern. There's a subtle degree of hyperpolarization. And so what would we see here? The absolute refractory period probably lasts to here. And then what happens with that overshoot, it creates something called a relative refractory period. All that means is we can makes the nerve fire again. We're going to need a little bit more to get it back to threshold. Absolute, that's going to block the way. Relative, that hyperpolarization is going to cause us to require more signal in a depolarizing or going positive to the interior cell to reach threshold. Just harder to get to threshold. So, local currents, voltage gated channels, sodium activation, inactivation gates open. Just reiterating. And so what happens, we get this positive feedback effectively. It's a kind of electrical, to me, it's not positive, negative feedback in the sense of homeostasis. But the positive feedback is because of the significant large amount of these channels in close proximity. So you get that big spike. Once it hits there, they really fire. Okay, and a big change that occurs. So they're showing it to you graphically. There's depolarization, and then repolarization. The inactivation gate closes. The spike stops rising, even though it's very, very rapid influx, and potassium opens and it repolarizes very rapidly too. Generally, repolarization is never as rapid as depolarization. You can usually see a difference, and you can see that subtle amount of hyperpolarization. Some potassium channels remain open while we reset that gate. The inactivation gate swings back out of the way, allowing, so we, even though we're going to need more oomph to make it go, but we can make it go. Okay, and so that slight dip, and then you can. That's when the sodium channels reset, meaning the activation gate swings out of the way while the main gate is closed. And then just show it to you again and again, and they have the animation is probably better.
Neurons communicate over long distances by generating and sending electrical signals called action potentials. Most action potentials originate in the axon's initial segment, a region also called the trigger zone. During an action potential, voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels open and close, thus altering the membrane's permeability to sodium and potassium ions. As these ions diffuse through the channels, the membrane potential changes. It depolarizes from the resting state of minus 70 millivolts to a peak value of plus 30 millivolts, and then quickly repolarizes back to minus 70 millivolts after a brief period of hyperpolarization. In this topic, we explore, step by step, the events that occur as an action potential is generated in the axon's initial segment.
We're done already.
Neuro polarizes back to minus 70 millivolts after a brief period of hyperpolarization. In this topic, we explore, step by step, the events that occur as an action potential is generated in the axon's initial segment.
Thank you. So I want to make sure everything was there. Okay. So again, just what we said before, repolarization is electrical. Then we have to reset the chemical or ionic conditions. That's the pumps. And as you can see, there are many all over. And they're just showing you the pumps. So again, it must reach threshold. It has to be, depending on what the resting is, 15 to 20 millivolts in a positive direction. Okay. And again, sodium permeability increases, the influx exceeds potassium efflux, and we get that feedback. But by definition, it's all or none. And this has to do with a pretty good sized difference. The neuromuscular junction goes in all directions. Here, everything is downstream. Wherever down that nerve the stimulation occurs. So if it's in the axon hillock, there's no backwards. It doesn't go back toward the cell body or the soma. It only goes, as you will, toward the tip of the axon. If it comes from a signal, and there are nerves where it signals directly to the axon, it goes from that point, as you see when you start looking at synapses, it goes from that trigger point on the axon, even if it's distal to or past the axonal hillock, and sends the signal. So it's not going backward. And the only thing that goes retrograde are chemicals and materials, recycling neurotransmitters, viruses and toxins, unfortunately, debris to be reprocessed or excreted or removed. Okay, that's all. Understand. So, but the action, when it comes to the signal itself, is a one-way signal. Okay, and it propagates from the origin down the entire length. And again, that those local currents are so powerful that it causes adjacent gates to open, and that's the nature of this dramatic, powerful change that's there. So they call it self-propagating. It's a little different in myelinated versus non-myelinated. You're going to see a little bit of this. Okay, in non-myelinated, it goes kind of section to section. In myelinated, it jumps between those sheath gaps, or what I call nodes. And it doesn't jump on the exterior. The signal is so well insulated, it flies through the interior of where the myelinization is, whether it's in the central or peripheral nervous system. And it's and where are all of those sodium voltage and potassium voltage gated channels in close proximity, just tons of them, they are at the sheath gaps or nodes. Okay? So since sodium channels closer to the action potential origin are still inactivated, it can't go in the other direction. Just can't. Not going backward. That's the inactivation gate. Not only does it govern this absolute refractory period, it also plays an important role in making sure it's all or none propagating toward the end of the axon. Forward. That's what that whole blab was all about. And you can look at that as well as I can. This is the last of these, and this is a very good animation. It's awesome.
Action potentials propagate in a continuous fashion in unmyelinated axons. Once an action potential is generated in the initial segment of the axon, it propagates the entire length of the axon. Recall that a threshold stimulus causes voltage-gated sodium channels to open. The influx of sodium ions generates an action potential. It also establishes a depolarizing current that flows to the next segment and brings it to threshold. Voltage-gated sodium channels open, regenerating the action potential in this segment of the axon. Current flows from this segment and depolarizes the next segment to threshold, thus regenerating the action potential yet again. In this way, regeneration continues in one direction all the way down to the axon terminals. The basis for unidirectional propagation is revealed when we take a closer look. By the end of the depolarization phase of the action potential, all voltage-gated sodium channels inactivate and voltage-gated potassium channels open. These two events render this segment of the axon temporarily insensitive or refractory to another depolarizing stimulus. However, voltage-gated sodium channels in the downstream segment are closed and receptive to a depolarizing stimulus. Thus, propagation occurs sequentially down the axon to the axon terminals. In myelinated axons, action potential propagation is a bit different. Here they propagate in a saltatory or leaping fashion. The myelin sheath consists of multiple layers of tightly wrapped glial cell membrane. But this sheath is not a continuous one. Exposed areas of axonal membrane, known as nodes of Ranvier, occur at discrete intervals. Voltage-gated sodium channels are abundant in the nodes, but largely absent between nodes. So, action potentials are regenerated at each node, not in areas covered by the myelin sheath. However, the myelin sheath does provide the insulation necessary for the rapid spread of depolarizing current. And the sooner the nodes reach threshold, the faster action potentials propagate along the axon. Saltatory conduction is extremely fast. Velocities often exceed 100 meters per second. In contrast, continuous conduction is fairly slow. Velocities rarely exceed 2 meters per second. Nevertheless, both continuous and saltatory conduction propagate action potentials over varying distances because action potentials regenerate along the way. Summary: propagation of an action potential. Once generated, the action potential propagates the entire length of the axon without decrement.
So yeah, and that really, and it gives you a very good idea about, how should I say it, uh, really about the distinction between saltatory jumping conduction in myelinated nerves versus non-myelinated nerves. Do the math and see how significant that difference is speed-wise. Nerves very, very rapid. And that's really not, it's all about the neurotransmitters, the rate determining step. I mean, nerves are, it's electrical impulses. So it's how rapidly I'm sitting here. I have a conversation with my wife's having a conversation with her girlfriend, over the phone or over FaceTime from here in Cancun and back out in Pittsburgh. I mean, real time. That's different here, much faster than whatever that is, 300, 400 miles an hour. The reality is, it's an electrical system, a rate determining step, and what slows it down, even though it's very, very rapid speeds biologically, physiologically speaking, are the neurotransmitters. That's the next big portion we do, but we're not going to do it in this dictation. And it's all about, again, frequency is amplitude. Frequency is the number of impulses. The higher the frequency, the louder, the stronger, the hotter, the colder, the more painful, etc., etc. You know, once it hits once you hit threshold, they're all alike. That's the interesting thing. It's not like muscle. We don't staircase. It's not like all the calcium hasn't been pumped and now we flood it again. So we reach maximum. Here you're reaching maximum every time. The only way you can discern the level of intensity of your brain is frequency. And that's all it is. It doesn't matter if you make it a bigger stimulus. It just means the stimulus will be more frequent. That's how we interpret it. And so the refractory period, voltage gated channels are open, so the neuron cannot respond to another stimulus. And so the way they are, and particularly because that inactivation gate is, I mean, the absolute is because of the inactivation gate. Time from opening channels until resetting ensures each action potential is 1 or none. And then when we took out the overall refractory period, they're open, so the neuron cannot respond. That's in general. Once that is open, we can't make another one. When it's absolute, there's under no circumstances, that's the inactivation gate. Once we start to see that close and potassium starts to go out, then we start to develop, as it goes below the hyperpolarization, that relative refractory period. Because as you can see, the sodium channels have gone back to resting state. That means the inactivation gate is out of the way, and that's the repolarization portion, where that sort of overshot resting. And so the red threshold is stimulated, so only a very, very strong one. I don't care about the door. And graphically, you'll see this again, and I want you to remember it because we do cardiac, which is we're going to start in lab probably not this week, but next week at some juncture. We'll start the cardiac unit, the cardiology unit. We'll probably do blood and lecture. We typically do cardiology with blood and heart in the lab. This is when that starts to really become significant. When we start to look at this, you can see it's relatively small. We're dealing with a millisecond of absolute refractory period, and 3 or 4 milliseconds of relative refractory period. Not that terribly significant. Bang, 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 bang. Think of how rapidly those impulses, if you go back to that previous illustration, you're talking about just millisecond. So, 1,000 of those in a second. Imagine the intensity that you could have. And then the velocities, all you have to know about this, it's axons and not in other areas of the cell. They vary. The thicker, the large diameter of the fibers, less resistance to local, so they're faster. It doesn't degrade. The amount of myelin, the thicker they are, the more myelin, the faster they go. And yes, saltatory is faster than that. The conducting velocity, continuous conduction, relatively slow, non-myelinated. Even your big sciatic nerve, when it begins, even the branches are myelinated. Let's say when it gets down towards your toes, but once you get close to the toe, all of a sudden, now it non-myelinates when it's just about to enter that muscle that's going to point your big toe up to the sky or push it down on the ground, like you're pushing down, like we are when we walk in the sand. Okay, and again, it's where the difference is the abundance of voltage-gated sodium channels, particularly in the sheath gaps, and that's the jumping conduction. I don't get a whole lot out of these, but if you do, that's great. And here, MS, very, very significant disease. We know it's of autoimmune origin. There's a lot of interesting things that are being studied about it. We know it affects the myelin sheath in both the central nervous system and to some extent the peripheral nervous system, because we see immune complexes destroying the myelin. It hardens them, hence the term sclerosis, multiple areas, conduction slows, ceases, all of these, just a very, very bad disease. All I can say. Weakness, and this is what happens. Think of the muscles you use rapidly, your eyes, your mouth, and then eventually all the other muscles. And yes, there's a lot. And once again, I'll tell you many times this term, vitamin D, vitamin D, vitamin D. You can look, you can take too much of it, but take high levels. You need to take more than the recommended daily dose, but you don't have to take a ton more and get good quality vitamin D. It's easily findable online. Please start doing it now, everybody. And they talk about these different fibers. I don't go crazy about this. People may need to know this for records or for MCATs. Okay, group A, big one for skeletal muscles, very fast. You can see 150 millimeters per second, 300 miles per hour. Group B, slower. Group C, smaller still. So it's about the myelinization. And we see these, when you see B and C, that's more going to organs. We don't do as rapid changes as we do muscles, etc., for movement. Okay. And local anesthetics, this is how they work. They block voltage-gated sodium channels, period. So the pain's still there. Your brain's just not perceiving it. That's why it feels numb. You're not getting any sensation. Anesthesia, absence of sensation. And there's other things, interrupting the blood supply, very cold temperatures. And same thing, blood supply is more a foot going to sleep. You know, we know what it's like when it's super cold outside. You come in, oh my goodness. And that's everything for this presentation. Thank you very much. Hope you're having a good week, not having to deal with me the whole time. And I'm happy about that. Enjoy. Talk one more of these, I think, before I see you on Monday. Goodbye.